Some people believe losing a husband is the hardest kind of grief. They were wrong. The hardest part came after the funeral, when my own children slowly erased me from their lives while I was still alive. Every Sunday, I cooked enough food for a family that never came. Every birthday, I left the porch light on, convinced this would finally be the year someone remembered their mother before they needed something from her. I kept making excuses for them until the afternoon I accidentally overheard a conversation that changed everything. One sentence shattered 10 years of hope, and instead of crying, I quietly sold the house they'd taken for granted, disappeared without leaving a forwarding address, and waited to see how long my family would take to notice I was gone. The answer still keeps me awake some nights. Before we begin, I'd genuinely like to know your thoughts. Do you think there's ever a point when a parent has the right to stop waiting for their own children? Or is that something a mother should never do? Tell me what you honestly think, because by the end of this story, you may see that question very differently. My husband didn't leave me for another woman. He left because cancer took him before either of us was ready to say goodbye. We had been married for 28 years, and in less than 2 months, my entire future disappeared from the kitchen table, where we used to drink coffee every morning. The silence after the funeral wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was discovering how quickly the people I loved learned to live without me. My son promised, "Mom, you're never going to be alone." My daughter squeezed my hand and said we'd have Sunday dinners just like always. I believed both of them because mothers usually believe the promises their children make while they're still crying. For a little while, those promises even looked real. Every Sunday, the house filled with laughter, grandchildren chased each other through the hallway, and I cooked the recipes my husband loved most. Standing at that stove made me feel as if part of him was still home. Then, almost too slowly to notice, everything started disappearing. First, one missed Sunday because someone had soccer practice, then another because work became overwhelming. Then birthdays were celebrated somewhere else. Holiday plans became shorter phone calls. Invitations turned into apologies. Apologies turned into silence. I kept setting 4 extra places at the table because hope has a strange way of surviving long after common sense has packed its bags. Every week I told myself next Sunday would be different. It never was. The hardest part wasn't eating alone. It was wrapping untouched food into containers while convincing myself my children were simply busy instead of drifting away. I stopped counting missed dinners and started counting unanswered phone calls instead. The number climbed much faster than I expected. One rainy afternoon, I drove 40 minutes just to surprise my daughter with homemade soup after she'd mentioned feeling tired. I stood outside her front door holding that warm container in both hands when I heard laughter inside. She wasn't resting, she was hosting friends. I reached for the doorbell, then heard my own name. "Mom worries too much," my son said with a laugh. "If we answer every call, she'll expect us every weekend." Someone replied, "She'll be fine, she always is." I stood there frozen, soup growing cold in my hands, realizing they hadn't forgotten me at all. They had simply grown comfortable believing I would always be waiting. Before we go any further, I'd genuinely like to hear your perspective. Have you ever witnessed a family slowly drift apart without anyone noticing when it truly began? I'm curious what moment you think changes a family forever. I didn't confront them that day. I didn't ring the doorbell, and I didn't let them know I'd heard every word. I drove home with the untouched soup beside me, set it on my own kitchen counter, and realized something painful. For years, I had been trying to earn a place in a family that already believed my love came with no expiration date. That evening, I opened my calendar and looked back through months of crossed-out Sundays, canceled lunches, forgotten birthdays, and promises that quietly disappeared. The pattern wasn't new. I had simply refused to see it. For the first time since my husband died, I stopped making excuses for everyone except myself. I still answered every phone call, but I stopped being the one who always called first. Days passed, then weeks. My phone stayed almost completely silent. That silence answered every question I had been afraid to ask. 3 months later, my son finally called. For one hopeful second, I believed he simply wanted to hear my voice. Instead, he explained that a business investment had collapsed and asked if I could help him with a large loan because, in his words, "You're the only person I can count on." I looked around the quiet kitchen where I had spent years waiting for my family to remember I existed, and realized those words weren't a compliment. They were a confession. He could count on me because I'd taught everyone they never had to count on themselves when it came to me. I agreed to help him, but something inside me changed forever that afternoon. Not because of the money, but because I finally understood the difference between being loved and being relied upon. He visited often while the payments mattered. We had dinners together, long conversations, even birthday flowers delivered to my porch. The final payment cleared 18 months later. 2 weeks after that, the phone stopped ringing again. This time, I didn't cry. I smiled with a sadness that felt strangely peaceful, because I finally had proof that my instincts hadn't been wrong all those years. The next morning, I called a real estate office in another county and quietly scheduled an appointment to sell the house where every empty Sunday had slowly broken my heart. Nobody in my family knew that while they were making plans for the future, I was preparing to disappear from the one place they assumed I would always be. Before we continue, I'd honestly like your perspective. Do you think parents sometimes confuse unconditional love with unlimited availability? Or do you see it differently? I'd be interested to read how you view that balance. The house sold in less than a month. I packed only what still belonged to my heart: my husband's handwritten journal, our old photo albums, the cast iron skillet we bought during our first year of marriage, and the quilt we wrapped around our children every Christmas morning. Everything else stayed behind, including the dining table where I had spent years setting places for people who stopped showing up. I moved nearly 3 hours away to a quiet lakeside town where nobody knew my story, changed my phone number, closed my social media accounts, and began living instead of waiting. 7 weeks passed before my children realized they couldn't reach me. At first, they assumed I'd finally taken the solo trip I'd talked about for years. Then they convinced themselves I simply wanted some time alone. By the time the silence felt different, nearly 7 weeks had already passed. They searched hospitals, called neighbors, and finally drove to my old house only to find another family decorating the front porch for autumn. That was the moment they understood I hadn't disappeared by accident. I had chosen a life that no longer revolved around being forgotten. Nearly 3 months later, my attorney called. He told me my daughter had written a handwritten letter. Instead of asking for my address, she'd simply asked him to pass it along if I was willing to read it. I read every word. A week later, I agreed to let them visit. My daughter stood outside my apartment, holding a photograph from our last Christmas together. Before she could speak, I noticed she'd been crying for hours. "Mom," she whispered, "my little boy asked why Grandma doesn't come over anymore. I didn't know what to tell him." I looked at her for a long moment before quietly answering, "Tell him Grandma waited a very long time." We sat together without speaking until she finally admitted she had spent years assuming I would always be there because I had always been there. My son arrived the following week. He didn't ask for forgiveness.
He simply placed every birthday card and unopened Mother's Day gift he'd forgotten to mail onto my kitchen table and said, "I kept buying them because I thought there would always be another chance." Neither of us could hold back our tears. I forgave both of them because forgiveness set me free, but I also told them something they had never expected to hear. "You can have a place in my future, but you no longer own my peace." That Christmas, they invited me home. I thanked them, then gently declined. Instead, they drove to the little town by the lake and spent the afternoon in my small apartment. Nobody expected a perfect family anymore. We simply shared a meal, told stories about the man we all missed, and when evening came, everyone hugged a little longer than before. After they left, I looked at the table. 4 chairs had been enough. There were no empty place settings, no untouched meals, and no waiting for promises that might never come. A few months later, I finally boarded the trip my husband and I had dreamed about for years. Standing beside the ocean at sunset, I smiled through tears and whispered, "We didn't make it here together, but I finally made it here because of the love we shared, not the loneliness I carried." That was the day I realized the greatest revenge isn't making people regret losing you. It's creating a life so full of peace that you no longer measure your happiness by who forgot to call. If this ending stayed with you, I'd genuinely love to hear your perspective. Which moment do you think truly changed this mother's life? The day she left? The day her children found her? Or the day she stopped waiting? Every answer tells a different story.